Good afternoon or good morning everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être avec nous cet après-midi. My name is Louis Baumier. I'm with the Institut de l'Énergie Trottier at Polytechnique Montréal, and we're happy to welcome you today for this fourth of 5 sessions of the Energy Modeling Initiative, where we're presenting modeling projects that have been funded by this initiative for the second year in a row. Just a few housekeeping rules before we start. Each presentation will be limited to 30 minutes, including Q&A sessions, and we will enforce that limit. So please make sure that you respect that limit. For the one that are not presenting, please put your microphone on mute. You can post chat questions or comments in the chat box. During the Q&A session, please raise your hand before asking a question. And please note that these sessions will be recorded and will be made available online along with the presentation slides. Just a quick words about this initiative. I won't say much. I invite you to go visit our website, where you'll see the reports that we produce, where one of them being a proposition for a more sustained and permanent initiative on modeling. Other projects that have been funded are also presented there, and there is a link for registering yourself and the models you're working on our modeling inventory. Today we have 4 projects that will be presented. The first one is by Brett Dolter, and I will give him the control right now so we can start. Brett, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm gonna get my screen shared here, make sure I've got it visible to everyone. Hopefully you can see those now. So yeah, thank you for well, first of all, for the funding support. Appreciate that, and it's such a great thing to have a modeling initiative in Canada. So very, very happy to see the work that you're doing at EMI. Today I'm going to talk about some work that we're doing that has been funded by EMI. It's joint work with Nick Rivers at the University of Ottawa, Kent Fellows, University of Calgary. I'm Brett Dolter. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Regina. And I've been working on electricity modeling the past few years. Started with a paper with Nick back in 2018. We're looking at decarbonizing Canada, all of Canada, and modeling Canadian electricity supply and demand across Canada. We've now increased the granularity of our model and looking at BC and Alberta. So getting some more detail within those provinces. And we've focused on evaluating the Site C hydroelectric project. There's a picture of it that you'll see there. This is a large hydro project in construction currently. And we've started with this project, but we intend to build on this work and look at other large-scale hydroelectric projects around Canada, like Kiask and Muskrat Falls, and generally have this interest in looking at the economics of mega projects, these big projects, and how they compare to a different way of meeting electricity demand and more decentralized methods. So there's been other work done on let me advance this slide. I hit the right button here. On the levelized cost of some of these large hydro projects. And here's some work Golding and Kirigu did in 2020. Here they're just showing the cost increases that have occurred in these hydroelectric projects. So they're often subject to cost overruns. We see Muskrat Falls has had now 3 cost increases. Kiask has had 1. This is Site C prior to the more recent cost increase. Started at 8.8 billion and is now up to 16 billion. So we've focused on that, and it's been a timely project to focus on. There's been a lot of discussion of it in the news. Here's some headlines. Site C has become a cash bonfire. So a lot of commentators talking about these high costs. And when BC Premier John Horgan was elected, he needed to make a decision about whether that project should proceed or not. It was a project he promised to reevaluate. And so it was one that he said he would look at, and he did, and recently made a decision, which I'll get to in just a second. But just to give you some background, as all of you know, you can look at levelized cost of a project, but that's not going to give you the whole picture. Some of the prior research on Site C did look at levelized cost. Like Golding and Kirigu paper looked at levelized cost. They found Site C to be more expensive than some of the alternatives. And we find the same results. This is our levelized cost calculation for Site C versus the other technologies in our model. Now, this is the levelized cost when the budget was 10.7 billion. Since that cost increase, so this is Premier Horgan announcing that they completed an evaluation of Site C. They realized there was additional geotechnical work that had to be done. That geotechnical work means the cost has now gone from 10.7 billion to 16 billion. And now Premier John Horgan has said that he's still moving forward with completing the project. So our analysis was originally hoping to inform that, and we had some work to offer prior to this decision. But now it's more of, I guess, looking at this decision to see was this the best path forward. So here's that levelized cost with that larger capital cost of 16 billion. You could see Site C at that cost is very expensive, more expensive than any other technology in our model, except for coal if you put a $170 a ton carbon tax on it. But levelized cost isn't going to give us the full picture of the value of Site C. You can't directly compare Site C, which is dispatchable, and wind energy, which is not dispatchable, based on levelized cost. So we start with this analysis thinking, well, there might be additional value that Site C has when it's operating within a system, helping provide dispatchable capacity. And so let's evaluate that value and get a sense of how valuable is Site C. So for this work, we're using a linear programming model. The basic framework is the same as the 2018 paper, but in that paper, we looked at all of the provinces. Here, we're just looking at 2 with greater detail. It's co-optimizing several things. So when we run a modeling scenario, the model is deciding which technologies to invest in and to build, whether to build transmission or not between balancing areas within provinces and between provinces, whether storage facilities should be built, energy storage facilities. Then, based on the available capacity, it's also dispatching these technologies over the course of a year for each hour, and dispatching transmission between regions. So to give shape to this model, we have intra-provincial demand detail, generation detail, transmission detail. Here's a map showing our demand areas. So we're using Statistics Canada's economic regions as our balancing areas. This was necessitated because we didn't have regional demand data for BC. So we've assumed that electricity demand is proportional to population within economic regions, and then allocated the provincial hourly demand to these regions. We'd prefer if we had data for every region. That would be ideal. And so, I mean, we'll keep hoping that...
EMI thing.
Pardon me? Oh, okay. And for Alberta, we're using data that is actually regional. So Alberta ASO has planning regions, and they have hourly electricity demand there that we then aggregate to the economic regions. We have transmission detail. These are not the actual transmission lines. These are just showing connections between the centroids of our balancing areas. And so we've got transmission between regions within the model. We have rich wind and solar data, and this was when we started this modeling work, really wanting to see, based on the resource that's available, how would this play a role? Greater wind generation, solar generation, how would it play a role in electricity futures? And what would be needed to balance it? So we have wind data by Mera grid cell and solar data by Quex site. Here's a look at that in average. So we have average wind speed by Mera cell on the left and average annual solar capacity factor from Quex station on the right. There's fewer Quex stations, so there's more of those squares, which are based on the Mera grid cells, that are coming from the same station. You can see, though, in terms of renewable resources, in southeast Alberta, that's where you find the best wind resource and also the best solar resource in those two provinces. And we have this data over time. It's a little animation showing you wind speeds. When the background is turning red, that's higher wind speeds. The arrows are showing wind direction. So we have wind speeds in all of these cells for each hour over the course of the year, which then is one of our parameters characterizing our model. Now, because BC is a hydro-dominated system, and it's important to capture how that system works, in this version of our model, we've really worked to give greater detail to the hydroelectric system in BC. So characterizing the river systems, the chained nature of hydro on the with the Liston Basin. The generating station there is GM Shrum. An output from that station becomes an input to the Dinosaur Reservoir. The message my internet is unstable. Can you hear me okay? If not, let me know when I can turn off my video. Still okay?
Yes, it's a bit unsteady.
We're losing you a bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe let me turn off my video and see if that will help. Okay, I'll try without video, maybe be less demanding. So there's the chained nature of the hydroelectric system. Output from one generating station becomes an input to a downstream reservoir. So we've worked to characterize the big hydro assets within BC to have that more realistic modeling of hydro in BC. Now, of course, the constraints, the ones you'd usually expect, you've got to have electricity supply greater than or equal to demand in each hour and each balancing area. So we have costless curtailment is one assumption we've made. It can be greater than demand. Supply can be greater than demand. You can only run what you build, so dispatch has to be less than or equal to available capacity. Transmission, same thing. You can't trade what doesn't have transmission to transmit. And then we have constraints on the minimum flow requirements for hydro facilities, maximum storage constraints for the reservoirs, ramping constraints for different technologies, how fast they can ramp up or down and respond to changes in demand. And we introduce a reserve requirement of 15%. Here's a look at our electricity demand data. On the left, you see a load duration curve. So we see the number of hours that are equal to a certain level of electricity demand. You can see BC has lower demand generally in both graphs. On the right side, you see hourly demand, and BC has that, well, both have the summer, it's lower demand, winter peaking. BC has less variability. Alberta has more of an industrial electricity demand base, and so the electricity demand is a little less variable through the course of the year there. So we run this model, and we run it for each scenario we want to evaluate. We run it with Site C assumed to be built within the model, and then we run the same scenario with all the same settings with Site C not in the model. And that's going to give us an idea of what is the replacement value of Site C. So if you have Site C present in the model, how much are you saving? And how much are you not having to build? In our scenarios, we're looking at decarbonization scenarios. So you can see on the x-axis here, we run from 0% greenhouse gas emission reduction from a baseline to 100%, so zero emission scenarios at 10% increments. And we run with two main sets of scenarios. In one set, we assume you can build new transmission between Alberta and BC. That's the solid line. And the other set, we assume that that is not possible, that BC and Alberta are not going to build further transmission between the provinces. You can still build more within provinces, but not any new transmission between the two. This is showing the annual value of having Site C present in the model. So when you insert Site C in the model, that's going to mean you save from the 20% decarbonization to about the 80% decarbonization levels, about 200 million a year. Now that value increases steeply when you get to 90% and 100% decarbonization scenarios, if new transmission can be built between Alberta and BC. If you can't build new transmission, the value actually drops off. In those scenarios, you'll see Alberta ends up building nuclear power plants at the 100% decarbonization level, and those have dispatchable capacity that means the value of having that Site C dispatchable capacity is less. And so that gap shows that there's actually a lot of value to allowing transmission links to be built, or encouraging transmission links to be built between Alberta and BC. Now, to put this in context, if we looked at what are the greenhouse gas emission reductions we'd get from a $50 a ton carbon tax and the policy of no new natural gas plants in BC, that would generate a 21% reduction from our baseline. The reduction would be higher for $170 a ton. We still need to run that. But that's existing policy. So for existing policy, we can now ramp that up on the carbon price, but we see where Site C, if you just had existing policy, Site C would create less than $200 million in annual value. Now we take these annual values and we calculate a net present value for the whole project. So we look at, okay, over the life of Site C, it's going to create value. We run the model for 2030 in these scenarios, but we also then run for 2050 to understand how does the value of Site C change as demand grows. And it does increase with higher levels of demand. Site C is more valuable. So we include that in our net present value, that the value of Site C is growing as demand grows. But if we take that annual value, assume it grows over time, and then calculate net present value over 70 years, the expected life of the hydro facility, here's the net present value calculations we get. And I've put on the graph the total cost of the Site C project with this new $16 billion budget, but also a line showing the avoidable cost. So when Premier Horgan announced he was going to continue Site C, he said, well, we want to continue because if we stop now, we would already have spent a little over 10 billion. And so we'd only be able to avoid 5.8 billion. So we get that avoidable cost of 5.8 billion. And we can look at, does Site C achieve it? Well, does its cost exceed, you can see here, it exceeds the value, the net present value that the project creates. And it exceeds it for every scenario. Well, every scenario, the total cost is higher than the value created. But for only two scenarios that we run, is the value created greater than that avoidable cost. So only if you're working to get to 90% or 100% reduction in emissions, so near zero or zero emissions, and you have collaboration between BC and Alberta, do you generate value that exceeds that avoidable cost? And so from an economic perspective, it's that avoidable cost that is relevant to the decision. The rest, the other 10 billion is a sunk cost that as rational decision makers we can ignore when we make our decision whether to proceed. It's that 5.8 billion that we need to evaluate. And so in only two scenarios do we exceed that value, this project. Now we look at what's going on when we are looking at our scenarios. What's going on when we decarbonize? I'll show you here the generation mix, different contributions by different generation types. in all of these lines, the solid line are for the scenarios where we have Site C. The dashed line are for scenarios where we don't have Site C. So you can see for the hydro line up at the top, the blue lines, when we build Site C, that solid blue line is higher because we get that additional generation from hydro, and then it drops when we don't have Site C. But the major changes in the generation mix come from introducing these emission constraints. All of these scenarios that you see here are assuming we can build new transmission between BC and Alberta. And as we increase our efforts to lower greenhouse gas emissions, we start to see more wind being built, so significantly increased wind output. And the purple lines that are declining are natural gas combined cycle plants. So if we're starting to reduce emissions, we're running and building and then running natural gas combined cycle plants less, and wind facilities we're building more of. Only in the last scenario where we're going to 100% zero emissions, 100% decarbonization, do we see nuclear get built. Otherwise, from 70 to 90%, there's some natural gas combined cycle plants with carbon capture and storage, the light pink line. Here's a similar look. Now the graph below is the one without transmission. So without transmission, less wind is being built in Alberta, but we're seeing more wind getting built when we can build transmission, showing that the value of BC's hydro system to those two provinces is allowing more low-cost wind to be generated, low-cost wind energy. Now, we do a sensitivity analysis because you can see here natural gas combined cycle with carbon capture and storage plants being built to replace combined cycle plants, and then a nuclear plants being built in the final 100% scenario. So what we're seeing then is one large project, Site C, being replaced by other projects that are also subject to cost overruns. So carbon capture and storage, I live in Saskatchewan. We know that was an expensive project at Boundary Dam 3. Nuclear power plants also frequently subject to cost overruns. So we want to look at how sensitive our results are to the cost of those technologies. And if we assume that those costs are higher, we do see that Site C has greater value. So now this is a sensitivity analysis. The green lines are the lines where we run higher cost nuclear and CCS facilities. And so if we assume that those nuclear facilities are going to be higher cost along the level of what we see at Hinkley Point C in the UK and Vogtle in Georgia, then in that 100% decarbonization scenario, the value of Site C just exceeds the 16 billion. But that's a very specific set of circumstances. Now I'm nearly done here. I'm just going to show a couple quick things. This is showing the dispatch of our model for January in a 100% decarbonization scenario. You're seeing in blue the hydro output, in green the wind output, and the way that they're working together. So there's a complementarity between wind and hydro in the model. Aggregate load is the top, the black line. And we see the same if we do just a scatter plot of output from wind and output from hydro. There's that relationship that when wind is strong, we lower the hydro output, and when wind dies down, we're not getting the generation from wind, we have more hydro output. And the last thing I just wanted to show you is that, we're looking at the value of Site C, and so we're looking at scenarios with and without Site C, but the transmission assumption is actually pretty important. So if we just look at the value of transmission and assuming we can build it or not, and compare scenarios along that line, we see that transmission has quite a high annual value. So this is, if you allow new transmission to be built between Alberta and BC, the value of that transmission is high, and it increases as we work to decarbonize. And so some of our future work, we're going to look more at that transmission value and what we can do there to encourage transmission and evaluate its effectiveness, cost effectiveness for situations like this, where you have a hydro neighbor of BC beside a province like Alberta with a very strong wind resource. Now, I'll just leave you with one last thought here. We know that BC is going ahead to build the Site C facility. Maybe some of you have heard of a project in Saskatchewan, probably not many of you have, but there are cases where hydro projects are started and that not completed. This is the Lacole Falls partially complete hydro station built on the North Saskatchewan River. This was constructed from 1909 to 1913, and because costs went up, the city of Prince Albert stopped the project before it was completed. They had a debt at that time, $3 million, which in those days was a lot of money, and they only finished paying for it in 1965, over 50 years later. So these hydro projects can be expensive, and other places have abandoned them in the past and have had to live with the debt. And I mean, BC has now decided to go forward with it, unless perhaps they find more cost increases. But let me stop there and take any of your questions.
Thank you, Brett. It was an interesting presentation. There is already a question by Andrew. Please, Andrew.
Good afternoon, Brett. Two questions, and maybe I'll place both out there, but if you want to answer one, maybe other questions from other folks should go first before my second question. My first question is, did you take into account the total power demand growth of aggressive electrification for climate change? I look at your demand graphs and it seems like there's 70 terawatt hours of electricity, which doesn't, of demand, which to my mind doesn't address electrification. BC's energy portfolio at the moment, only 17% of our entire energy portfolio is electricity, 83% is fossil fuels. So if you compare on a joule by joule basis, and you can account for perhaps clever transportation schemes that are more efficient, electrical engines are far more efficient, we've still got to double at minimum our electricity system in BC, and we currently use 60 terawatt hours. So when you look at the value of Site C, to me, it's very important that you do it through the lens of the future demand by 2050. And if I'm mistaken, forgive me, but I didn't see that significant, doubling and quadrupling of power that we're going to need if we're truly going to address climate change.
Yeah, thanks for that. So yeah, we have demand growth in here. I think it would be interesting to do a sensitivity analysis to that demand growth. So we could have scenarios and see if I think we assume based on the Canadian Energy Regulator forecasts, we're growing at about 1.6 to 1.8% a year in BC and Alberta. Now, those growth rates would be higher if we are succeeding at electrifying the rest of the economy. So definitely worthy of further investigation and a sensitivity analysis.
Yeah, because well, I think it's important because your conclusion could be very misleading and for BC politics in my mind, because Site C only represents 1/20 of our total power capacity. And if you take 83% of our energy in fossil fuels and convert it with a notional 50% efficiency improvement, that's still a complete doubling of our electricity system here in BC, which is massive, right? And so I would argue that if you reran it with those kind of true joule requirements, not just driven by carbon tax, then you suddenly get a very different result, because the penetration level of intermittence will be huge to satisfy that demand. And then the battery effect, the storage facilities of BC are still insignificant at that point. And then kicks in the levelized cost of new storage, whether it be lithium ion or hydrogen, and it gets so the potential here for misleading the decision makers is quite fraught. I really encourage you to load the model up with double the demand and see if your outcomes would be the same.
Yeah, we'll try that.
Yeah.
Maybe for next edition. Maybe we'll do that for the next edition. Thanks, Andrew. I will now ask Normand to go about your question, please.
Thanks, Brett. First, I should say that not all hydro projects go out of see their costs spiraling. I mean, that's been the case of Romaine in Quebec, where costs have been mostly contained, so it's possible. Second, I don't understand. I mean, the Site C seem to have a very large impact on your model type of electricity production, much more than I would expect, given that it's still relatively small in terms of energy production in British Columbia. So I don't see how that can justify the big changes you find in the gas in the natural gas with CCS or wind. I mean, that's
yeah. So thanks. The changes are actually mainly driven by the decarbonization constraints, and so that's where you start to see gas go down.
No, but it's when I compare, you showed with or without Site C, and the differences are huge, which I would not expect given Site C is small, really.
Yeah, well, I'll take a closer look to put that into perspective.
All right, thank you. One question from the chat: how much new capacity, transmission capacity, should be built in the high decarbonization scenario?
We have, I believe it's. Well, I'm thinking now when Site C is introduced or not. I believe it was at least 1,500 megawatts. But yeah, I'll need to check that. That's one we should actually put a section in our paper and explore that a bit more.
You still have a few hours to add that. Thank you. So that brings us to the end of that 30-minute period. I will now ask Nastaran Ayrenpu from Simon Fraser University to start our presentation.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. My name is Nastaran Ayrenpu, and I'm a research associate at Simon Fraser University. So today I present the progress and current result in the development of an open source model referred to as BC Nexus Model on behalf of the research team I work with, Philippe Singh, Dr. Andrew S. Wright, and Dr. Taco Knight. So we are part of the Delta E+ research group at SFU. But before we start, I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm fortunate and grateful to be able to live and work on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people. So the BC Nexus model has developed to provide decision makers in BC with insight into synergies and trade-off of climate policy and their impact on the land, energy, and water resources. So there are growing number of countries are passing ambitious climate policy centered mostly around the decarbonization of energy system. As yet, few studies have accounted for the impact of the single sector decision may impose on the security of the other resources. So the neglection of this can increase the uncertainty and risk in meeting the climate targets, as well as it can affect the energy transmission outcome as well by changing the electricity cost or technology choices. So the BC Nexus model is designed to explore the linkages between the land, climate, energy, and water, and it's designed based on the connection of these resources with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The term nexus that we use to describe our models refers to the interaction among interdependent systems. So that means the change in availability or functionality of one system can impose pressure on the security of the other independent system within the nexus. And the goal is to create a feedback mechanism between these systems to safeguard the resiliency of the whole system. So to develop our model, we use the modeling framework named CLUES, stands for Climate, Land, Energy, Water System. And CLUES itself is the one of the branches of the extended actually framework from the modeling platform named Osmosis. So at the core, CLUES is the capacity expansion model, is used linear programming. It's do the cost optimization analysis, and it's driven by policy. So when you develop a model in the CLUES, the output can be technology mix and cost to meet the power demand, the synergies and trade-off between all the Nexus system and the CO2 emission to implementing that policy you are investigating. This scheme here shows, it's a simplified figure of the BC Nexus model, the component and packages. So we have three major components in our model. It's the energy system, water system, and land system. So we provide the model exogenously with the demand portfolio and the demand portfolio for all these systems. The line here shows the linkages between these systems. The example of how the energy and water and land system are interacting with each other can be, for instance, in the agriculture sector, we need water. However, we also need power to pump that water to the agriculture sector, or we need the land to produce biofuel, and we need water to produce power as a cooling mechanism or for steam. And all of these activities are producing CO2 that the model tracks and monitor. So when we designed the structure of the model, we calibrated the model with the BC portfolio. Within the energy system, we collected data such as capacity, nominal generation, actual generation, the lifespan of the power project, the residual capacity, the cost information, the energy demand from different non-electrical fuel in each sector, like residential, commercial, and the data about import and export of the fuel. Within the land system, we collected data such as the land use type and the sizes and the demand projection in the period of the modeling. And we also provided model with the crop suitability estimation data for each part of BC, so we can give the model a chance to expand agriculture to meet the demand in the future. We use the model named Global Agroecological Zoning to provide this data for our model. The current version of the model, which is the first version, is only tracking the water demand and availability and CO2 emission. So it's not a two-way interaction at the moment. One of the important information in the model is the forest carbon uptake. So the forest can play important role in climate change by absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. In our model, we can assign negative value of variable cost to the forest land. So the model includes reforestation consideration within the optimization analysis. However, at the time of preparing this presentation and EMI report, there was an ambiguity about the role of the Canadian and BC forests in how much they absorb CO2 in the compare with how much they emit. So in the scenario that we're reviewing today, we didn't put this option in any of the scenario. So 3 decarbonization scenarios were investigated for the BC between 2030 and 2050. Our baseline scenario, it was based on Canada's Energy Future report published in 2019. So the reason we choose this scenario as a baseline is that in this report, it was a very moderate approach toward the electrification and decarbonization of BC energy. The other scenarios, so scenario 1 and 2, are the variation of this scenario by taking more aggressive electrification toward the 2030 and 2050 energy system. The first scenario, we did it without putting any carbon penalty in the model. And the second scenario, we put the carbon penalty in the form of carbon tax to investigate the changes. So we investigate 3 scopes in this scenario. 1, the technology mix in the power system to meet the demand. The second one, the magnitude of impact on the water and land. And also the third one was to see if we can meet the CO2 emission targets in BC. So the figures here show the power generation capacity in the baseline scenario. Because reserve margin is a critical attribute in providing a reliable power, we run the model once with reserve margin of 10% and once without. So the left-handed figure shows the technology mix to meet the power demand without the reserve margin. So the model decided to, the optimization analysis run by the model decided to not invest further in the hydro or natural gas and biomass, but just invest into the wind power to meet the demand. When we add the constraint of the 10% reserve margin, since the wind alone is not sufficient to secure this, the stable supply, and because of its nature, it can be served as a reserve margin, the model decided to decrease the amount of the investment in the wind system in around 2040 when the hydro capacity max out, and invest into other baseload options such as geothermal and here natural gas. So in our first scenario, as I mentioned, we had a closer examination of the energy consumption by fuel type and application. And within the residential and commercial sector, the demand for natural gas is often for space heating. We assume that all of these demands will be electrified by 2050 by switching to the heat pump. And the same aggressive approach has been taken within the transportation sector, and we assume all the vehicles will be electrical cars by 2050. Due to the higher efficiency of the electrical cars and heat pump in compare with the traditional gas-powered cars and natural gas furnaces, at the end, it was interesting that the total demand actually decreased, the total energy demand in first scenario. But you can see that the electricity demand increased in this scenario. So having a closer look at the technology mix to meet the power demand, by increasing the electricity demand, we can see that the model invests more into the geothermal and natural gas. And because the electricity demand is increased, the hydropower maxed out earlier. So the model invests earlier into these two these two energy options. But when we look at the power generation, one note that this natural gas amount you can see in the beginning, sorry, I know it's small, the graph are small, but these are the residual capacity from the current BC capacity portfolio. So the model choose to use this residual capacity. But as you can see, we are not using the new natural gas capacity when in the power generation. And that's because the model just used the natural gas as a standby to serve as a reserve margin. So that means that we are building capacity that we may never use, just because we need to provide a stable supply. So here we are bringing the second scenario to compare. So the second scenario, the demand portfolio is exactly same as the first scenario, with the exception that now we have a penalty on carbon tax by having we have a penalty on CO2 emission by having a carbon tax. So the model is still invest into new natural gas capacity. However, because of the penalty, the model don't want to use any of the natural gas, so it's invested earlier into the geothermal energy to remove the natural gas, even the residual capacity that we already have from the power generation. The first encouraging observation of this scenario are that the impact of electrification in residential, commercial, and transportation sector are low on the land and water system based on the model output. And the reason can be that the model didn't decide to further investment into the solar, which that reduced the land use. There is a low biofuel demand from agriculture sector in BC, which again reduced the land use from the power generation. And that's because most of the biofuel demand in BC comes from the municipal waste and the forest. And also because we did the electrification, we were moving from the fossil fuel, which minimized the impact of power energy transition on water use. The other scope of our investigation was if we can meet the BC targets based on any of these scenarios. So I compared here the baseline scenario, which is based on the Canadian Energy Future report by government, and our first scenario, which was the more aggressive approach to electrification. The red circle here are showing the BC emission targets, and you can see we are missing all of the targets in all the scenarios. However, we didn't change the demand in the industry sector, demand portfolio industry sector in our scenarios. So the only way to meet our targets it's if the industry decrease is emission industry sector by half in 2040 and another half in 2050. So some of the key finding, the summarize of the key finding from our scenario is one, the model didn't choose further investment in solar generation capacity in any of the scenarios, despite the low development cost. And the reason is due to the low solar irradiance recorded in the only solar power project we had in BC. It was a low water and land impact in our electrification scenarios, which is the very good news. So we can do the electrified our sector with a low impact on water and land. And the baseline and first scenario highlighted the significant role of the baseload energy option are playing in the power grid stability. To meet the provincial CO2 emission, the industry sector has an important, significant role, and the further investigation of how we can reduce our emission in the industry sector is very important. And the result of the scenario, the second scenario, suggests that policies such as carbon tax can change the timeline and direction of investment in the technology mix, and it's a very important note. So the next step for our modeling is three major directions we are going to investigate. One, addressing the gap in representing the energy transition, addressing the gap in the representation of cross-disciplinary linkages, and also investigate the possibility of extending this Nexus model we have to include the social and biodiversity elements such as health impact, natural security. This is the reference for one of the graphs that I use. And before I finish, I'd like to thank EMI for financially support this project and all the people who support our research. So thank you very much. I would be glad to answer any question.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation and for submitting that project. I would start with a question, since there is no question yet on the chat, or the one has raised its hand.
I have a question.
You have a question? Also,
Claudio Canizares, yeah, from University of Waterloo. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a question regarding grid stability. I wasn't quite sure what you were referring to, though. Is that the reserve requirement? Is that what you meant?
Yes, it's mostly in the form of the reserve margin that you need
Okay.
exceeded capacity. Yes.
Yeah, but now my question regarding that reserve, who provided that particular value of reserves? I guess it varies depending on the mix of energy and resources. So I was curious how you obtained a 10.4, I think you mentioned.
Yes, it was in one of the reports from let me see. It was an annual report of the transmission report. I can send you the reference. I have it. Sorry, it's not.
No, I'm asking this because it varies from place to place depending on your mix. The
yes,
more remote renewables you introduce, the more reserves you require, especially this wind.
Yes.
So it's not a fixed number. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a reference number from that report. They mentioned that it can be. Normally it's higher. So we use the minimum value that we had just to make sure that it's a fair number we're putting in the model.
Yeah, it tends to be higher when you have more renewables. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your thanks for your comment.
Norma, please go with your question.
If there's no other, yeah. There's a lot of geothermal in your model, which is unusual. We don't see that coming out so much in general. So why is that so? I mean, are you giving a favor price, or how are you getting that?
Well, sometimes it's not coming up because it's not included as an option for the model. So we didn't favor any technology in the model. We provided geothermal, nuclear. So we gave the model the option to choose based on the cost optimization analysis. We didn't favor any technology, but yeah, one of the future research we want to do, investigation, is to invest into how much capacity available actually for geothermal in BC, and try to then put some cap on the technology used for the model.
Thank you. Okay, my question now. There was no reduction in the emissions from the industry sector because you purposely left it out of the modeling, correct?
Yes, industry sector is complicated, so we needed more time to investigate exactly how we want to electrify it or reduce the demand for the fossil fuel, but how to change the demand portfolio for the industry. And we didn't have a chance to go further and to investigate that. Yeah, it's future research for us.
For next year, right? Because then we could assume that, yes, there would be some impact, maybe more impact on land and water use, right?
Exactly, yes.
All right, okay, thank you. Any more questions? Anyone with, I don't see any raised hands.
I can see a Stefan.
Do I see one?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
I don't want to jump the queue.
No,
It's
that's
okay.
Please
All
go.
right. Yeah, I'm just wondering like what the carbon tax was factored at, if it was like a growing carbon tax, maybe like if a couple of different scenarios could be set up to evaluate that. Like I'm just curious about that aspect.
Yes, for this scenario, for the second scenario, we just followed the federal carbon tax because the BC is kind of following the federal carbon tax. So we use that, but it's very interesting area for ourselves for future work as well, because as I mentioned in the second scenario, despite the carbon tax, the model is still invest into natural gas. And we like to invest more and see at what level of carbon tax the model move from the natural gas completely and invest into other source of energies.
So you did a couple, like I know we have it set at 50, but it will be moving to 170.
170 by 2030.
30.
And then actually we did the linear, well, in the federal, I think they say $15 per year after that. So we follow that.
Okay.
But as you mentioned, it's an area that you can just play with the number and see which one give us the better answer. Yeah.
And can I ask a second question, unless somebody else wants to jump?
No, please do.
So my second question is, like you mentioned something about EV uptake increasing over time, and I'm just wondering if electric rail is factored into these models. I know we had some previous presentations, some from last week, and like I've had a look at one of those models, and I can't quite clearly see that electric rail, like subway or trains. I don't get a clear indication that that's being factored in. So I'm just curious, like, if that is situated in your model at all, or just EV?
What we did, we said that 50%, so 100% of the vehicles switch to electrical car. In the case that 50% switch to EV and 50% switch to electrical transportation system. Andrew, are you here? One of my colleagues is here. He looked at this.
Thank you.
Hi guys. Yeah, so to answer your question, Stefan, yes, we did a mix. We said 50%, sorry, of the 100% of fossil fuel that was used for transportation, 50% of that would be still single occupancy car use, and 50% would be highly efficient electrical transit. So that would be rail, electric buses. And this speaks to my comment earlier about the efficiency. You know, if you add up 83% of our fuel as fossil fuel at the moment, and if you do a joule for joule comparison, so, 1 joule of work moving 1 kilogram, 1 meter through, at a certain velocity, when you use electricity, ICE engines are only 30% efficient in terms of mechanical work. The rest is heat. So we took all those translational factors in to be an accurate joule to joule translation as opposed to a joule to joule replacement. So this is why the total number of petajoules falls, is because I can do more work with the electricity system because it's almost 100% efficient. So we took that two efficiencies into account, the technology translation and then smart public policy, where you encourage people to use transit, not just consider their same behavioral modes that we do today. And so that's more people on transit, and we argued 50% as a stakeholder mark in this analysis.
Thank you for that. I have one last that just it's an addendum to what you just addressed, Andrew. I am curious if you try to manipulate those shares a little bit, like moving to like a 30-70 ratio and other sort of scenarios, or you settled on 50-50?
I think for our work, you can play with those all day long.
Yeah.
And the more important messages here are the absolute scale for us personally as a group is helping the public get its head around the absolute scale of the transition that we need to do. You know, British Columbians are proud that we're hydro and we're clean, but it's only 17% of our energy mix, you know, and so the scale of the transition has to be huge. And whether it's 30% of people on transit or 70% people on transit, it's still crazy huge. And we have to make some real timely decisions to affect that. And so our big push is, you're correct, we could do lots of analysis with different cuts, but you know, the very minimum is a 2 times expansion of our electricity system, with all the bells and whistles thrown at it to save as much as we can possibly can in terms of rebuild. And so for me and us as a group, we know that when renewables hit the kind of 40% penetration mark on a grid system, grid stability becomes a real issue. And so that base load, that reserve power, and so Site C for us is quite an important attribute or asset, because we're quickly going to hit that 40% intermittency, and then storage is a critical component of that going forward. And so I'm excited about Nastran's work, because for us it's the beginnings of a tool that will help us really help answer those questions. And we got a long way to go, but this is our first kick at the can. So thank you for your question, Steve.
That's awesome. Thank you both.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. We will now switch to our third presentation. That's by Robin White and Tuo Kosa. Gentlemen, the floor is yours. Robin, you're still on mute, huh? Please unmute yourself. Robin, you're still on mute.
Robin, if you're full screen, you might not see the unmute button, but if you hover in the lower left corner, you should see the microphone appear.
Oh, you can also just tap on the space key. Just hold the space key and you can unmute.
Or stop your screen sharing and then you'll see all the options to unmute yourself.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry.
No problem.
So now I'll try and share the screen. Sorry about that. So does everyone see the screen here?
Yep, we're all good to go.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So you're just seeing one slide right now. You're not seeing any notes or anything?
Negative, it's all good.
Okay, great. So sorry about that again. My name is Robin White, and with Tuo Kosa, my colleague at Environment and Climate Change Canada, we'll present to you the study that we did called The Role of Hydrogen Supply Pathways in GHG Mitigation in Canada. This was a collaborative effort between various different divisions within Environment and Climate Change Canada, NRCan, and our consultant, who's also the license holder of the model, called Systematic Solutions. So the overview of the presentation will cover our motivation, followed by an explanation of our modeling framework that we use, the model Energy 2020. We'll go over the scenario development and the assumptions used for this project. Tool will then go over the modeling results and analysis, and I'll go over the takeaways and some of the model improvements that we'll do for future model development. So in terms of motivation for the project, the Government of Canada has committed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. One of the main approaches to achieving the net zero emissions is to pursue policies like electrification, but this is not suited for decarbonization of certain applications, in particular high-grade heat and feedstocks in industry and heavy-duty freight. The increased interest for hydrogen as a non-emitting fuel in Canada is increasing. A few months ago, NRCan released a hydrogen strategy for Canada, and several studies and reports on hydrogen have been released by provinces like BC and Quebec. There are a few key methods for producing hydrogen that were explored in this project. Two of the leading means of producing hydrogen are steam methane reformation of natural gas and electrolysis. But both of these methods are associated with greenhouse gases. The steam methane reformation has direct emissions, and both SMR and electrolysis have emissions associated with the emissions associated with the electricity used for that electrolysis. We're aware of some studies that have looked at the potential of hydrogen for mitigation in Canada, but we're not aware of any studies that have looked more in depth at how the choice of the production method of hydrogen can influence the GHG mitigation potential, or the implications that the chosen hydrogen pathway has for electricity capacity and generation. So this particular study is looking at the hydrogen mitigation potential via different hydrogen production pathways out to 2050. The modeling framework that we're using is Energy 2020. It's a multi-sectoral energy bottom-up energy end-use model. We have about 70 sectors and 35 fuels. It's a partial equilibrium or system dynamics model. It simulates consumer behavior, so it doesn't give an economic. So it tries to account for the fact that consumers are not necessarily making economic choices. It doesn't fully equilibrate government budgets and markets for employment and investment like CGE models, and it models individual years. So it's modeling the path to get to various different emission targets. On the left-hand side, you'll see that there are about four different key demand side sectors in the model, and these provide the energy demands to the supply module. And the supply module, there are 6 or 7 supply modules, of which the electricity and hydrogen are the ones that are of key importance for this particular study. So the supply module then will supply the demands required and will communicate the prices to the demand module. This integrated setup here can produce the emissions. So we produce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants for the entire country. And this is what this is the model that we use to produce the greenhouse gas emission and air pollutant projections for Canada in our annual reports. The model also has the possibility of running in a hybrid mode. So there's a macroeconomic model that can be integrated with the Energy 2020 structure in order for us to take into consideration any macroeconomic impacts of various different policies. Our electricity supply sector is a detailed unit by unit representation. We have 24 different electric plant types, such as solar PV, onshore wind, oil, gas, combined cycle, and coal with CCS. We have exogenous historical units in the modeling framework, but we also can build endogenously units throughout the projection year to meet any electricity demands. The model also represents a transmission network. It's represented by a node in every one of the provinces within Canada and Labrador. So the model determines the amount of electricity needed at each node by minimizing the cost to meet demands from all the sectors. And the generating units are dispatched across 6 time periods in each of the winter and summer seasons. This is a graphic showing how we model hydrogen in Energy 2020. Each of the major demand sectors can use hydrogen. The hydrogen demand is communicated to our hydrogen supply module that provides that hydrogen, which in the current version of the model can be supplied through either electrolysis or through steam methane reformation of natural gas. The electrolysis is then further divided into the source of electricity used for that electrolysis, which can either be through the grid, through dedicated renewable electrolysis units, or through interruptible power that would be otherwise curtailed electricity. This component of the model is currently only represented in Ontario. The SMR can also be coupled with CCS in our model to sequester the CO2. The data sources that we use for our model are StatsCan for the energy data and the Canada's National Inventory Report for GHGs and air pollutants. We draw most of our technology parameters from the US Energy Information Agency and the National Renewable Labs from the US. The prices are based on Canada's energy regulator. They provide us with wholesale oil and natural gas price projections. And our drivers for the model are our GDP from Finance Canada, population growth from StatsCan, and the oil and natural gas production projections are also from the CER. The reference scenario that's the basis for our modeling work here is based on the reference case for Canada's GHG and air pollutant projections 2020. And it includes all policies and measures that are funded and legislated as of September 2020. So it doesn't include Canada's strength and climate plan measures, such as the $170 carbon tax. The output-based pricing system also wasn't incorporated into the hydrogen producing sector. We do cover output-based allocations in sectors like chemicals and fertilizers, upgraders and refineries, but we didn't attempt to cover that for the hydrogen production in this modeling exercise. This is a schematic of our hydrogen scenarios that we ran. So for all of the scenarios, we ran the same high end use assumptions for hydrogen. So high hydrogen demands in vehicles and in the natural gas pipeline network and through feedstocks. And then we modeled 3 different scenarios representing different splits of hydrogen supply that could come through various different combinations of SMR and electrolysis. Those were then run through our model, and then we looked at the energy and emissions coming out to compare the different scenarios to see what implications the chosen pathway had on energy use and GHG emissions. Our demand assumptions, we put in the natural gas distribution pipelines up to a 10% by energy basis, hydrogen in the fuel mix, added in feedstock, coke replacement in iron and steel, and added in 100% market, sorry, 100% sales in HDV trucks with hydrogen fuel cells by 2050. And then the electricity grid expansion that we incorporated in the model was based on a portfolio approach that favored wind and solar with some smaller amounts of gas and peak hydro. So these were the amounts of different kinds of capacity that were added in order to meet the increased electric demands from electrolysis. And then the scenarios that we ran different fractions of different kinds of electrolysis sourced through grid, renewable, and interruptible power, and natural gas combined with CCS that increased over the projection period from 0% to 100 to 90%, 95% sequestration by 2050. And so in the lower cost scenarios, we focused on natural gas with CCS in the Western provinces in Ontario, where there's some saline formations for carbon sequestration. And as we moved into larger cost scenarios, we started to favor, first of all, grid-based electrolysis and then dedicated renewable electrolysis. And now we'll switch over to Tuo, who will go over the modeling results and analysis. So we don't hear you.
So under the microphone button in the lower left, you might have to change your input microphone. Sometimes Zoom selects the wrong one.
Est-ce que ça marche maintenant?
Yeah.
Oui, c'est bon.
Oh, yes, okay. So yeah, in this section, I will present you the main result of our study. And on this slide, we have cost variable for selected electricity generation technologies in Alberta, and it is for the medium scenario. So I won't go through all the details, but what I really want to highlight here is that wind has lowest MCE compared to gas oil combined cycle. And also when you look at variable cost, you see that that of onshore wind is negative. And of course, that is due to credits from the OBPS. Within the model, our dispatch rule favors technologies with lower variable cost. And I really think that it is fundamental to understanding the subsequent results for both GHG reductions and electricity generation. Next slide. Okay, so here we have hydrogen production cost for some provinces in 2020 and 2050. So in general, you see that natural gas-based hydrogen is cheaper compared to electrolysis through the projection period. And yes, also with the exception of grid electrolysis, most of the technologies have lower production cost in the future. So you can see, for instance, interruptible electrolysis production of hydrogen halved by 2050. I think we were at $12 per kilogram of hydrogen, and by 2050 we are around $6 per kilogram. And yeah, we see also that the renewable electrolysis, we go from $10 in 2020 to around $6 by 2050. So the fuel cost as reflected through variable cost dominated for grid electrolysis. And that is just because electricity prices increased over time due to assumed increases in transmission cost. And I really think that it's also worth mentioning that our assumption on the efficiency of electrolyzer is quite conservative compared to other sources, right? So if I remember correctly, by 2050, the efficiency of our electrolyzer are around 66%. And it goes from 61 to 66 between 2020 and 2050. Finally, the high levelized cost of capital for interruptible electrolysis in Ontario is due to low plant utilization rate. So you know that these plants rely on intermittent power sources. So hydrogen plant will operate only when sun shines or when wind blows. So that has a direct impact on the cost of capital. Yeah, so in this slide, we have side-by-side hydrogen production and demand by scenario between 2025 and 2050. So we see that hydrogen demand increased to between 11 megaton to 13 megaton by 2050, with lower increases for higher cost scenarios as a result of more expensive hydrogen fuel, of course. And when you look at production, you can see that production differed slightly lower than demand. And we assume that the gap is compensated by import from international markets. So that's it for this slide. And on slide 17, now we focus on the medium scenario. On the left, we have hydrogen demand by end use, and on the right, we have hydrogen production by technology. So there is not much to say here, since production profiles are consistent with our scenario assumptions. So for instance, you will see that the black area, which is for interruptible electrolysis, if you remember correctly, interruptible electrolysis production of hydrogen is allowed in Ontario only, and the market share does not exceed 10% by 2050. So this is why it is quite thin. And it's the same for renewable electrolysis. Renewable, big provinces, some big provinces do not produce hydrogen using renewable electrolysis for the medium scenario. By big provinces, I mean British Columbia, Alberta, and if I remember, Saskatchewan as well. And yes, on the demand side, we can see that hydrogen demands were split approximately evenly between hydrogen used in transport fuel cell, the natural gas mix, and feedstock requirements. And that's also consistent with our scenario assumptions. So now we go to GHG emissions in Canada. So in this slide, we try to dive into the potential of hydrogen in terms of GHG abatement. So by 2050, we estimate our reduction between 140 and 171 megaton. And by way of comparison, in the hydrogen strategy for Canada, the mitigation potential by 2050 is around 190 megatons. So we are not way off. We are just like kind of the same range, right? And we also see that higher cost scenarios add more GHG reductions due to the increased of efficiency equipment efficiencies, right? And prior to 2038, the medium scenario exhibited the lowest overall GHG reduction due to fossil fuel fired electricity generation in Alberta. Then on the right, at sectoral level, we were able to split total reduction between fuel switching and efficiency gains. So we see that impacts from efficiency gain exceed those from fuel substitution for higher cost scenarios. And we were also able to capture emissions related to hydrogen production. So you see that in the low scenario with a large share of emitting hydrogen production, we estimate that by 2050, we have 5 megatons coming from hydrogen production. And when you go to the medium scenario, it drops to 2 megatons only. So for the next two slides, we try to give some insight on electricity sector. So here we see that there is a substantial increase of electricity generation for higher cost scenarios compared to the reference case. And of course, that is to support electrolysis deployment in the future. And what is also interesting to see here, sorry, just go back to the, yes, thanks. So what is also interesting to see here is that we reach and exceed the milestone of 1,000 terawatt-hour of electricity generation before 2050. I think it's around 2040, I think. And like that gives us a sense of the magnitude of electricity needs in the future. So now side by side, we have generation capacity and actual generation in Alberta for the medium scenario. It is definitely interesting to see that even though fossil fuel generating capacity increases throughout the projections, the actual generation decreases as of 2035 when VRE generation start to increase sharply. And this is a direct consequence of our dispatch rule, which favored low-cost VRE plants. And also that explains why the medium scenario had lower GHG reductions prior to 2035 as compared to other scenarios.
Okay, so our modeling revealed that we'll need to be working on making refinements to the electricity capacity expansion and dispatch to allow extra VRE capacity to compensate for the limited availability of wind and solar resources. We'll also need to look at improving the electricity storage dynamics and reflect any seasonal generation differences that could be utilized for hydrogen storage and those kinds of things. So in conclusion, we demonstrated that our model is capable for evaluating the economy-wide GHG and electricity impacts of different hydrogen supply pathways. And we showed in our particular modeling framework that emission reductions were between about 140 and 170 megatons by 2050. And those were accompanied by significant increases in the electricity generation and capacity to support the electrolysis. But obviously those are highly dependent on the level of VRE integration that can be assumed, and those are dependent on capacity factors for wind and solar, transmission links between various different provinces, and preferences by various jurisdictions for different kinds of technologies. So with that, we'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was a nice presentation. Are there some questions?
I have a question. This is Claudio Canizares from the University of Waterloo. It's regarding, regarding the use of hydrogen going from electrolysis to use in the grid. Do you guys look at the difference versus batteries? Typically, the efficiencies it's hard to justify for grid application. So I was wondering whether you can comment on that.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
The issue of hydrogen from electrolysis back to the grid. So through fuel cell, for example, the efficiencies are low compared to batteries. So from studies we've done, Waterloo typically doesn't compete well with batteries for that type of application. So I was wondering whether that was factored in somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, for this particular study, we didn't include in fuel cell electric generation from fuel cells. We didn't include that in this study precisely because of the high energy losses, but we may do so in future studies.
Okay, in that case, how do you factor it back into the grid? In what way? Because you had energy consumption on the grid side, right? Did I understand that correctly or miss that?
Well, I mean, we needed a lot of more electricity to run the electrolyzers.
And then the hydrogen is used for what specifically?
Well, then the hydrogen is used by end use sectors. So
burning it or that kind of approach?
Well, I mean, for like it was used in the natural gas transmission, the natural gas distribution network, feedstocks in industries, and fuel cells in transportation vehicles.
Okay, thank you.
Normand, so
please. Yes, you put the cost of hydrogen in the modeling section. So is there, these costs are extracted after modeling, or they are in the model?
Well, the reason why we put that in there is because it's somewhat of a hybrid, because some of the inputs are, I mean, they're inputs, but the electricity costs are actually outputs of the model.
Okay.
Because it's highly dependent on what goes on the grid.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Can I ask a couple questions?
Yeah.
One is related to the cost of the SMR plus CCS. Well, because the cost of CCS varies quite a bit depending on how far you go, like the percentage of carbon capture. So did you use just some assumptions about the mixed, or how do you deal with the variable cost of CCS?
So for this particular study, we were assuming that the unit would be using a conventional CCS unit, and it was based on the NREL study for their centralized CCS units. We're assuming ATR with CCS, so 95% capture further on in the projection, but we made a simplification, so we didn't actually adjust the CCS cost to account for those those advances in technology.
Okay, so you're assuming a pretty high capture rate.
Well, I mean, we're assuming in this modeling exercise, we assumed that uptake was going to be progressive over time as pipeline networks and storage facilities were constructed. But I mean, originally the cost parameters for the SMR CCS units are based on a capture rate of 90%.
Okay, that's good to know. The other question I have is when you're looking at the grid electricity, and obviously there is a life cycle carbon emissions associated with all of these production pathways, and different grids has a different kind of emissions associated with that. And when you're looking at grid electricity generated from hydro, do you include in your assumptions the emissions from the reservoirs?
No, I mean, those will be included under LULUCF of the inventory, but we don't account for those, no.
Okay, that's really good to know, because I think that in the hydrogen strategy, when they're looking at the carbon intensity of hydrogen, they actually include it, but in the modeling, it's not included.
No, we don't include that, no.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, you have some questions.
I wanted to thank you, Robin, and I wanted to riff off Claudio's comments and two questions back, and I think about battery versus hydrogen for going back to electricity as a pathway, and I think this is really interesting because the costs and the energy density considerations make for a very interesting problem to be figured out, and that is what would be the right balance between hydrogen storage for long-term energy capture and storage, and lithium batteries as an example for overnight storage. And as we wrestle to try and find sort of practical solutions to our growth, I think you've laid down some really valuable insights here. So thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Right, and that quite positive comment that will end that presentation. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
It is now time for our final presentation for today. People from the University of Waterloo. The screen is yours.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. So first, I wanted to thank the Energy Modeling Initiative for providing support for this project. And let me just enlarge this. Okay. And our project was on electrification of Canadian northern communities using low emission microgrids. So the work is a collaboration between Dr. Canizares and myself. We are faculty members at University of Waterloo, and Enrique Vera, who is a PhD student or PhD candidate who helped us with this project. So the outline of this presentation would be as follows. We are going to talk about the issues with electrifications in remote communities first. And then we go over the electrification models for remote communities and the challenges that we are facing. And then we talk about the proposed model that we have for microgrid planning for remote communities. And then we go over the case study that we did in one of the particular remote communities and the assumptions and the scenarios that we developed, and we highlight our contributions and the future work. So the main problem is when it comes to electrification of remote communities, the main problem is that they are highly dependent on fossil fuels, and that causes higher electricity rates due to higher transportation costs and lack of access to bulk power systems. And this also creates low flexibility and reliability in energy supply for remote communities, and also it creates high GHG emissions, which has been a big problem so far. So the challenges we are facing is to overcome such problems relates to the remote geographical location of such communities, and also the extreme weather conditions and associated consumption patterns, and lack of availability of energy resources in those areas. And to address such challenges that we mentioned, we're going to propose a deployment of microgrids with renewable energy sources and energy storage systems to utilize the available energy sources in such areas, and also reduce the cost and emission and provide more reliability. So the electrification model that we have here is to plan an appropriate energy supply mix to satisfy remote communities' demand, and also promote decarbonization using renewable energy sources and also energy storage system technologies. And such model supports Canada in meeting its zero emission targets, and also identify the most economical size and mixture of the generation resources, and also their time of deployment. This is the major contributions of the model. And also the model allows quantifying the potential benefits of MGs or microgrids with renewable energy resources and ESS. And one of the major gaps that we try to fill using the model that we propose here is the inclusion of hydrogen systems as part of the energy storage system installation. So the energy planning model that we have in place is based on a mixed integer optimization model, which is has a cost minimization objective function. And it has a set of parameters and decision variables and technical and environmental and economical constraints. So for the objective function of the model, we minimize the total capital costs and also operations and maintenance costs by including both operational and planning constraints of the model. And the variables are binary. We are including binary variables for both on and off status of diesel generators, charging and discharging status of the batteries, and hydrogen source, and also purchase of diesel generators. And they're also integer to represent the investment in renewable energy sources. And the continuous variables from the model are to illustrate the generation output, state of charge of batteries, and hydrogen storage capacities. So the inputs of the models are estimated parameters based on the electricity demand and renewable energy source availabilities. And also we have a set of technical and economical parameters depending on the technologies that we're using, and also depending on the socio-economical area that we are locating the microgrids at. So again, the output after solving the model, the output would be the net present cost of the investment. We can easily find the net present cost of the investment for new diesel generators, renewable energy capacities, and energy storage systems. And also we can find the net present cost of the operations and maintenance for both new and existing diesel generators, RES, which is renewable energy sources, and energy storage systems. And we can estimate the fuel cost of the diesel generators and also their fuel consumption, the amount of the fuel consumptions they have. And we can plan for the annual capacity additions for new diesel generators or renewable energy sources, and also energy storage systems. And then we can obtain the total saving and GHG emission reductions from the model. So again, the objective functions of the provided model includes all the net present cost. It includes capital, operations and maintenance, and fuel costs. The constraints that we are including are representing the hourly operations of the remote communities, where they decide the time and the size of capacities needed in the long term for diesel and batteries and fuel cells. And also the set of constraints that we have here are commissioning of new generators. Again, the model is versatile to include different sources of generation. We have supply-demand balancing constraints. We are including the operating reserves in the model. We also include the limits for the diesel generators and their service life, and also their availability during the time horizon of the planning model. And we also consider the available solar power generation and wind power generation, and the state of charge of the batteries and their limits, and also the hydrogen system constraints. So the model that we developed is using GAMS, and just to give some perspective of how we solve it, we solve that using a Cplex solver. And just to give you some contents, the results that we are providing here is using a server. It's a Xeon CPU, and it has 256 gigabyte RAM, but we can definitely run the model in smaller systems as well. So and the code is available upon request as well. So I would like to invite Enrique to highlight the study that we had on one of the remote communities. Enrique?
Thank you so much. Okay, I need to share my screen. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Enrique Vera, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo. I'm going to describe the study case. In this case, we use the community of Sanikulek. This is a community located in Nunavut. It's the only permanent settlement where nearly 800 people reside. The types of consumption that we have in this community are residential and institutional, but mainly is residential. The type of generation they have right now is 100% diesel, and the type of electricity grid, they are not connected to a power system or other microgrids there, and isolated remote community microgrid. The assumptions for this study case, first, the time we have considered a representative day for each month. Therefore, we have 288 hours for the simulation, just to reduce computational burden. The economical parameters, we have a discount rate of 8%, cost of diesel of $239 per liter. We have considered that we have 2 windows for investment for renewable energies and energy storage systems for the first 5 years. And then we can invest in the new diesel generators, because the microgrid already has diesel generators. We can invest in new diesel generators between the 3rd and the 10th year. And we have some technical parameters here: reserves, 50% for wind, 20% for solar, and 10% for load. Then we are not considering ramping up and down constraints, because the diesel generators can turn on and off in fractions of 1 hour. The temperature and standard conditions, 25 degrees Celsius. And we are also considering that the continuous charging and discharging of the batteries is 4 hours. We have considered a load growth of 1% per year, and a minimum load for diesel generators of 40%. For the inclusion of renewable energies in this case, we have considered that for all the scenarios, at least one hydrogen system must be included, and 1% of the annual energy should be supplied, must be supplied by solar or wind. So we have our base case, that is business as usual, where the operation is based on diesel generators only. And then we have 4 case scenarios. As you can see here, first, the first case will be all the available resources, meaning diesel, solar, wind, batteries, and hydrogen. And then 2A doesn't include batteries, 3A doesn't include hydrogen, and 4A is a case where there's no diesel for the operation. We only operate a microgrid considering renewable energy sources and energy storage systems, and we consider diesel only for emergency cases. Then we have 1B, which is diesel, wind, batteries, and hydrogen. We are not considering solar in this case. And then we have 2B with no batteries, with no hydrogen, and finally, wind, batteries, and hydrogen. The operation is without diesel, and we consider diesel only for emergencies or and reserves. So I'm going to give you an idea of the information, the input data that we use. First, we have the demand that ranges between 750 kilowatts for the first year and 960 kilowatts for the 20th year. We have considered that the addition of solar panels is actually a continuous variable, because, as you know, solar panels, the addition is more versatile, so we can add, we have considered this as a continuous variable with these parameters. Another of the input data was the solar temperature and the monthly solar irradiation, which are inputs for to compute the produced power by the solar panels. We consider in our model that diesel generators, 2 top types of diesel generators can be added. And these are the characteristics of these generators. And as you can see, fuel consumption curves are non-linear, and therefore we have used piecewise linearization for the representation in our model. The existing diesel generators with their fuel consumption curves, as you can see here, we have 7 existing diesel generators, and they operate in alternate years, so they can preserve their useful life. For the wind turbines, we consider wind generators with 250 kilowatts of nominal capacity, and the wind speed ranges between 3.2 and 8.2 meters per second. With this wind turbine specifically, we can guarantee that we have 90% of the time at least 150 kilowatts of production. For the batteries, we have considered lithium batteries with 100 kilowatt hour and 20 kilowatt peak power of charging and discharging with these characteristics. For the hydrogen system, a full hydrogen system includes fuel cells and like with these characteristics, an electrolyzer with these characteristics, and a hydrogen tank. As you can see, the full hydrogen system includes an electrolyzer that's consuming power from the grid to generate hydrogen that is stored at high pressure in a hydrogen tank, and then later that hydrogen is used by the fuel cells to produce electricity that's been injected to the microgrid. Here I'm going to present the main results from our planning model. These are the results for a 20-year planning horizon for all the scenarios that I described before. So as you can see here, we have the capacity additions for all the technologies: diesel, solar, wind, batteries, and the hydrogen system. And the model also provides with the fuel cost, operation and maintenance cost, the investment, and of course the total cost, which is the objective function. We have found that in all the cases we have emissions reductions that go between 51.9%, and we can achieve 100% emission reduction in case for A and for B, of course, because we are not using diesel for the operation. And also this means that we have 100% renewable penetration and operation, right? Also, we've seen that we can achieve savings in all the cases. And you can see here that we have the total cost for the base case, business as usual, as 25.76 million. That includes operation and maintenance cost and also fuel cost. And we have savings in the order of 16 to 34%, right? There was only one case that increased the cost, and that is the case 4B. And the reason for that is because we don't have solar. Finally, the best total emission reduction and savings were case 2A and case 2B, where we can achieve reduction in emissions up to 93.5% and a reduction in the total cost of the operation and investment of the microgrid of 34%. The contributions are our model. This model contributes to electrification and decarbonization because it guarantees the fulfillment of the electricity needs of the inhabitants of the remote communities, mainly through the supply-demand constraint. It reduces uncertainty related to the prices of fossil fuels by integrating renewable energy sources and energy storage systems, which promotes reduced use of fossil fuels and reduced GHG emissions, as we saw, between 51% and 100%, which benefits Canadian economy. This also enhances electric grid flexibility because we have more types of generation technologies serving the microgrid. All this supports Canada in meeting its zero emission target. In policy design, this model can be used to design policies aligned with energy sustainability and affordability for remote communities in Canada. And as the model facilitates the consideration of environmental, economical, and community factors. As part of a national platform, this model can be used by experts, researchers, investors, and policymakers, as the model helps to determine requirements for financing, construction, management, and real-time operation of remote community microgrids. This can incentivize cooperation in order to create products, services, and strategies that help mitigate and solve energy-related public problems for remote communities. Future work will be apply the model to address the needs of remote communities in Canada, because as we mentioned before, they have special needs, and it's important to take them into consideration. Also consider more sophisticated methods to incorporate uncertainties in the proposed model. And finally, test the reliability of different generation mixes. These are our references. And thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. That leaves us almost 10 minutes for questions. So are there any questions? I don't see any hands. No question in the chat. Could you say, I have a question. Could you say a bit more about the fact that by not having solar was increasing the cost?
Exactly. It's because of the wind turbine that we decide to use. So let's say if the model or the optimal solution says that we need 150 to 100 kilowatts, we could use solar because, you know, it's more versatile, but because we're using a 250 kilowatts, I'm more than less forced to use that wind turbine, and that increases the price.
Even so, but I would say that it's kind of counterintuitive to me. I've thought that the fact that there's not that much sun in the winter time was making the load factor, let's say, or the load factor on the solar cells a bit lower and maybe not aligned with the demand, or not properly correlated with the demand.
Yeah, well, in this case, we forced not to have solar. We decided not to have solar. In these cases, we decided not to have solar. So if we, you know, compared to the other case, the price is a little bit lower, because instead of investing on one wind turbine, I can invest in some solar that is not as high as the 250 kilowatts from one wind turbine.
And still meeting the demand.
Exactly. Yeah.
For the target. Oh, that's interesting. Well, thank you. So do others have questions? Well, if not, that would conclude our presentations for today. Thank you again, gentlemen. I would share my screen for one last time, and would invite you for our upcoming session in 2 days, our last session. There are still you still have time to register. Follow this URL that is the URL that is displayed here. I will thank again all the presenters and all of you that participated today. And I will say thank you and take good care of yourself. Bye-bye.